Welcome to Native Voices in STEM. My name is Carletta Chief. I'm an associate professor and extension specialist in the Department of Environmental Science. I'm also the PI of the NSF NRT IndigiFuse. And today I'm excited to have Dr. Michael Kotutwa Johnson join us to talk about his work on agriculture and Indigenous perspectives. I've known Dr. Johnson for a long time. We actually started our graduate school together and then crossed paths again when he returned to finish his PhD. And the last time I saw him was at his defense. And there was a huge turnout, standing room only, and just a really amazing dialogue and energy in that room. And I also received seeds from Dr. Johnson, and he asked me if I planted them yet, and I actually haven't. So that's a challenge for me. But I welcome you here today. I'm speaking from the University of Arizona, which sits on the homelands of the Tana O'odham and Pasquayaqui people. This Native Voices in STEM is co-sponsored by the Sloan Indigenous Graduate Partnership at the School of Natural Resources and the Environment and the NSF NRT IndigiFuse. I want to now introduce our special speaker, Dr. Johnson. Dr. Johnson's a member of the Hopi Tribe in Northern Arizona, and he serves as the Native American Agricultural Fund's Research Associate. He's a traditional Hopi farmer and practitioner, and he gives extensive lectures on his work and his professional career in terms of the Hopi dryland farming, which his people has engaged in for over 2 millennia. I also recommend watching Inhabitants, which is a movie that he's featured in. And it's very insightful on the work that he does. Some of the previous work that he has conducted includes agriculture and land-related issues with the First Nations Development Institute and also the Indian Land Tenure Foundation. And the Sloan Indigenous program will be so proud to say that he is a graduate of the Sloan Indigenous program and an alumni of the University of Arizona. He also is a recipient of the American Indian Graduate Center Scholars, and he was a natural resource district conservation who was assigned to the Hopi Reservation for NRCS. So without further ado, I want to give the time over to Dr. Johnson and welcome.
Thanks a lot. You know, I can see Dr. Comby and Dr. Bashir is over there on my screen, and Dr. Comby is one of my committee members, and Dr. Bashir I've known for quite a while. I took one of his eco-hydrology classes, but first when I got to the University of Arizona. Challenge, but it was a good one. I learned how to synthesize a lot of things, and so, you know, that's still a great class. And so anyways, you know, Carletta, thank you for having me here, and also the Sloan Foundation for also being a sponsor of this organization. The Sloan Foundation is a really important organization trying to get more Indigenous people out into the fields of STEM. And so what I'm going to talk about today is just Indigenous perspective of STEM. You know, I myself am a person who's involved in STEM on a pretty much a daily basis. But a little bit about my background first and kind of the organization that I work for. Right now, I work for the Native American Agricultural Fund. It's a fund that was established out of the Keepsagle Settlement. The Keepsagle Settlement was basically a discriminatory lawsuit against the United States Department of Agriculture based upon basically not having enough or not doing enough loans to Indian people by the Farm Service Agency. And so, but one of our main objectives is to support and promote Native American farmers and ranchers' continued engagement in agriculture. And so some of the areas that we do fund are business assistance, agricultural education, technical support, and advocacy services. So some of our eligible grant recipients, this is our 4th year. There's already been an RFA that's been advertised for this coming year. Is to fund 501c3 organizations, educational organizations, CDFIs and native CDFIs, which are community development funds, tribes, state and federally recognized tribes. That's who we basically fund. So that's kind of what I do. I'm the research associate there, but I do a lot of issues that look at conservation and natural resources and agriculture, kind of all in the same shell for our organization. So the goal of my research, when it first started off was to, first of all, is to identify the various American Indian participation in these NRCS cost share programs, and also recommend policy changes to increase the participation. Wow, that's important. Why is this important? Because if you look at this thing that I found out, this quote that I found out by the under the environmental science policy, it says here that Indigenous people protect 80% of global biodiversity on a mere 25% of the planet's land, with less than 5% of the world's population. And if you really think about that, 80% of global biodiversity, what happened to the other land that was supporting all that? That's something that I always ask myself. But that's one of the main reasons why I chose this field and chose to go into STEM, to help look at that and to help alleviate some of those problems of this vastly disappearing biodiversity that we have in the country. For somebody told me that one time that, without biodiversity, we have no true sustainability. And that I truly believe that. So kind of what I wanted to do with this agricultural presentation, kind of the nutshell of it, is I kind of wanted to talk at it from a direction of STEM. I just didn't want to give a lot of overview of what Hopi agriculture is, but I want to kind of show some of the science behind it and how it relates, to the 4 fields of STEM. And so I think that's important because, every time I give a lecture just on Hopi agriculture, they always ask me these different questions, and I do have answers for them. But when I talk to the scientists, when I was there getting my dissertation, a lot of my questions that are asking me were, please explain that. Why are you doing this? What does this do? And so I was able to do that with the classes that I took there. So first of all, for over 2,000 years, we have tested and adapted our agricultural techniques. Our knowledge of the environment enables us to overcome the many challenges of farming without the use of pesticides, herbicides, and man-made irrigation systems, which are commonly used by today's conventional agricultural systems. And I want to start off by saying that I have nothing against conventional agriculture, because there are Indian people that do use conventional agriculture. But what I am saying is probably not the best practice to help with some of the environmental challenges that we have been facing and are facing in the future. So when I want to talk about health time, because this is one of the principles of science. If you have something replicated for hundreds of years, to me, it's pretty validated, right? And so I'm looking at this picture in 1915 on the left-hand side of a Hopi bean field, and I look at my bean field in 2015, the same thing with the cornfield below taken in 1901 and my cornfield taken in 2015. You can see that our land management aspects have not changed. This is only 100 years, but we go back 2,000. So 2,000 years of replication has something to say that, yes, we are doing a science. A lot of this is based upon observation too, what we see out there, how we can relate to the environment. It's environmentally friendly. So who are the Hopi people? Now, this is one of the questions I get often, but this is kind of our pathway, and this is kind of the importance of why we're in agriculture. And so when we first got to this world, we call this the 4th world, but when we first got to this world, we were told that we would be farmers, and we were told that we always have to have faith in everything we do. And so what you see here is you see a petroglyph that was probably done in around 13 AD or maybe even before that. And it shows 2 paths on this road right here. It shows the people on the top going up, and then they're holding hands or whatever they're doing, and then they're going up this kind of staircase, and then it drops off all of a sudden. And so what that tells us that's what's happening today. That's the age of modernity. That's showing that a lot of us are going to start to kind of fade away from our traditions, and we're going to choose this more modern path, and we're going to eventually disappear. And I could, like people that did at Chaco Canyon and also some of these other places, they wound up moving after a while. And so that might happen again. And you see the guy at the bottom there, he's bent over representing an elderly gentleman. He has a planting stick, and he's taking care of his cornfield out there. But his path goes all the way off the rock. And so what that's saying, if we believe in our traditions and we keep practicing all that stuff that's allowed us to live here, then we're going to be going on into the next generation or maybe even the next world. And I think that's very important because that's the true concept of sustainability. It's taking those things that you have that have worked over a tremendous amount of years and reinforcing those. And so a lot of my work today tries to reinforce these traditional practices that are out there. And so that line in the middle right there that connects the upper and the lower, that tells us that those people up there still have the chance to come back down and go upon that path, you know, which if they choose to do so, only if they choose to do so, because like in life, everything in life, we always have that choice. So let me talk about our location and environmental factors, because this is important of why we grow things. First of all, we live in a semi-arid climate on the northeastern part of Arizona, up on the Colorado Plateau, with only a 45 to 5,500 foot elevation. We only receive 6 to 10 inches of annual rainfall a year. Now that's important because when I was at Cornell, they told me that I needed 33 inches of annual rainfall a year. The crop scientists told me that, the agronomists told me that. Everybody who was anything told me I needed 33 inches of annual rainfall a year in order to grow corn. And I said, I don't know what that's about. I said, we grow super corn at Hopi. Maybe we do something different and stuff like that. And so, you know, and so that's what I told them. And so, you know, we have desert shrubs and grasses, sandy and clay loams. You can just see by the background of the environment, it looks almost impossible to grow there because remember, we don't use any man-made irrigation. We do use irrigation, but it's only given to us naturally. And I'll explain some of that during my presentation. First of all, you know, Hopi is one of the few places I know where corn is raised to fit the environment and the environment not manipulated to fit the corn. You know, in the Midwest, they manipulate the environment a lot. You know, they manipulate it so much so that, you know, there was a recent study that just came out that looked at the nitrogen effects on the I think it's the ribosomes of the root systems. And those root systems over time, after being genetically bred, are shrinking. They're shrinking. And when that happens, that's not good, folks, because when your root system shrinks, you have nothing bringing in nutrients to that plant. And so that's not good. But if you look at our plants, you can see how far the spacing is. And those roots go out 20 feet, you know, but you have to remember that all of our techniques that we use are designed to conserve soil moisture, you know, and I'll show you how that's done. First of all, you know, when I talk about the environment we live in, a lot of this is what I call place-based conservation. You know, a lot of things are grown where they're grown because they've been there for a long time, at least food that people eat. And so this is just kind of my little table that I featured that look at it, combines traditional ecological knowledge and this term that I came up with, or maybe it's been came up with before, this indigenous agricultural knowledge. And so all of it has to do with place-based conservation. Some of this stuff is going to be talked about in the new paper that I've just got accepted in the Journal of Water and Soil Conservation, the Journal of Soil and Water Conservation that's coming out this summer. So how do we define conservation? How do we do this? You know, there's scientific terms of conservation, but we just have a little bit of different take on it. Well, Hopi farmers, as well as most indigenous tribes, look at conservation from the point of view of caring for a relative and not from a scientific point of view of conserving a natural resource. You know, and that's kind of important because you have to have this intimate relationship. We have this intimate relationship with who we are as farmers. And so everything around us has to be in tune. Otherwise, if things get out of balance, things don't grow well, you know, and there's a number of factors of why they don't do that. So what makes growing these crops in the semi-arid region possible without substantial annual precipitation, man-made irrigation, or use of herbicides, pesticides, and supplements like NP and K, manure, or compost? You know, to me, this is just another form of regenerative agriculture. You know, that's a new term that's been out there for I don't know how many years, but we've been doing that for a long time. I get into arguments sometimes with those people who are really into regenerative agriculture because it is really about the soils. And they're saying you have all that barren area on the ground. How can that be regenerative agriculture? And I have to explain to them it's the holistic approach that we take when we're talking regenerative agriculture. We're not just talking soil, we're talking land, you know, the whole thing. We're not just talking part, we're talking the whole thing. And so they kind of get that. And I can show you in a little bit why we plant like that and where those roots go and all the organic material that comes in. First of all, you know, there's 3 key factors in Hopi agriculture when it talks about observation. You know, first of all, because we need to have soil moisture in our landscape, we depend upon how much winter snowfall we have in the wintertime, because that over time seeps down into the different layers of of soil that would settle there over time. So the next thing is the monsoon rains. You can see after just one event, that field is flooded. You know, that field is flooded, and because it's flooded, it brings in all this new nutrients that come along. You know, and they're not harmed. They don't go through eutrophication because they're out above the water surface, and they're able to breathe, and they're able to keep getting that oxygen. Also, one of the main important things that I'm still working on too. In fact, the Native American Agricultural Fund, we just had a big convening on seeds and how we need to try to enhance the viability, and also come up with possible legislation to help protect those and get those back more into the community. But the heirloom seeds is what we have out here at Hopi. Those things are over 2,000 years old. They were brought up from down south a long time ago. We migrated from there, and we carried that with us. But over time, we've come up with this almost perfect system, you know, to grow corn, which requires 33 inches of annual rainfall a year, but it really doesn't. And so when I talk about this, when I talk about the conservation of soil moisture, I believe I talk about this water budget. You know, a lot of the water budgets that I've seen, and maybe Brashears can correct me if I'm, Dr. Brashears, check me if I'm wrong, but a lot of our soil moisture is everything is geared towards inputtings. You know, it's not geared towards output. This is our water budget. This is what we're looking at. So when we're planning our crops, we're making sure that we're trying to take care of all these different symbols down there. And so it's all about soil moisture. And because if we don't have the soil moisture, we won't be able to germinate the crops, and they won't be able to grow. So everything from spacing to planting depth is determined upon how much moisture is in the soil. Now, somebody asked me one time, you know, they say, well, how do you know there's moisture in the soil? You know, you got to be prepared to talk about that. And I said, well, one of the guys came up to me, I think it was from the Agriculture Research Service, and he says, can we give you some thermometer soil temperature probes to see how much moisture is in the soil? And I said, well, I don't know if we can do that or not, but I would be glad to take some from you. But I said, these particular plants right here, these are our soil moisture probes. You know, for hundreds of years, we've been using it just like that, you know, because because of the different root systems, how far they go down, we can tell initially in the springtime, but what we see on the ground of how far we need to plant. And then we make adjustments, or how deep we need to plant. And then we make adjustments over the growing season. And so these are our traditional soil moisture probes. You know, that's kind of neat. It didn't cost me $100, whatever they're charging for a soil moisture probe now, but they're basically what nature provides us. And so that's part of our observation. The other thing that's important too is the location of fields. Now, when I was talking about irrigation, this is a good example of this. We plan on what they call alluvial floodplains. You can see, you know, when we have an event up there, and in events, you know, monsoon events, they're just not one big event in one place. They're scattered out. You know, some of our traditions tell us that we don't have just one field, and that's why when we get married to another Hopi person, we're taking care of their field. It also helps with a better chance of survival, because you're not only planting in one location, you're planting in several locations throughout Hopi. And so, but one of these monsoon hits in the right time, what's going to happen is this big rock outcropping that's above in the middle there, that acts like a giant tarp. It acts like a giant water facility. And so it brings all that water coming down, boom, into your field. And you can see all that water, all that new water that's in there. But what that leaves behind is all those new sediments, all those new minerals that comes off that rock outcropping into the field. So we don't have to rotate our crops. My field's about 75 years old, other than my grandfather's field. And the pH levels on that are still between 8.3 and 8.8, which is what you want to have when you're trying to grow things like corn. Now, we raise other crops like different types of beans, different types of squash, melons even. And so we do this without irrigation, but we're experts of where to plant things and how to make things grow. Some of these are just what I call place-based adaptive management techniques. You know, I want to highlight that picture right there that has just a single thing of corn with all the new soil in there. That's just after one of those monsoon events. So you can see we've got about 4 or 5 inches of new soil in there that's packed with nutrients. The picture on the lower right-hand corner, it should be on the lower right-hand corner, it depends on how you're using the screen, of just the leftover residual matter. See, most conventional agricultural, they'll take the whole plant. But what we do is we leave that there, and what that does in the wintertime is that allows it to catch snow for snow drifts, adds more organic material to the soil. It also, in the springtime, when we plant in between those rows, so we're not using the same spot, those also protect us from wind, so they act just like wind protectors. And so they do several things, and that's important. And so some of the other pictures are simple that, some of just like the watermelon picture, we have that staked out because we want to make sure that the vines don't wrap up and drop the flowers, because that's where the fruit comes from and so forth. But these have all been adapted to fit our area. So what are the importance of heirloom seeds? And I kind of want to talk about this. First of all, they're very biodiverse. Like I said, without biodiversity, you have no true sustainability. Very drought tolerant, only 6 to 10 inches of annual rainfall a year. They're subsistence based. That means they go right back into the community. Nutritionally beneficial. Now, there was a study done recently on the nutritional aspects of traditional grown foods. They're about 10 times to 1 more mineral and iron content in these particular crops. Ceremonially important, and they're also very culturally significant. Because if we didn't have our corn, we would not be here where we are to this day. So it all combines. And you can see that picture was taken in around July. You can see how cracked up that soil was. Anything like that, even in Texas, when I see pictures with the same type of cracked ground, that corn was gone. But look at our corn, it's just thriving right now, and so that itself tells a lot. So what are the benefits of Hopi farming practices? First of all, it's going to help reduce obesity. I think that's important. It helps reinforce family culture values. It stabilizes families and communities so no one goes hungry. The unfortunate fact of that is that this year during the COVID crisis, we've seen long lines, even out here, and people in their cars getting, food boxes, because we become so dependent upon the federal government for that's what we have to do. And it's unfortunate, because even back in the 30s during the Great Depression, we didn't have lines like we have today. And that tells you something. They're also environmentally friendly. Recently, the GAO report came out in about 2018, 2019. And it says that the 2 key programs that NRCS has, environmental quality incentives programs and the conservation security program, they were not basically doing what they were supposed to do as far as helping the environment. There are some other things wrong with that, but we're correcting that. It also increases the concept of sharing. And also, you learn to have a real respect for the land and what it provides. So this is kind of the most important part of this presentation. How Hopi children learn STEM while reinforcing Hopi culture, values, and practices. And I kind of talked about that, but out there, you learn how to be an agronomist, you learn how to be an hydrologist, you learn how to be a botanist, you learn how to be pretty much anything you want to be in the sciences, because they're all integrated into our cropping system. You have to know a little bit about everything at the basic level in order for you to have a successful crop. And you become expert at that. So it's a matter of just developing programs that can enforce some of those science terms into these little kids' heads so that they can understand and they want to be scientists if that's what they want to be, or mathematicians or wherever else may be out there. I think one of the best things that I get when I do this, when I have the kids come down, is, I ask them what they want to be when they grow up. And after they have my little 5-minute spiel that one of these little kids will raise up, I want to be a hydrologist. I want to be an hydrologist. And it's so cool that they're so encouraged at that age. But, everything we do out here in Indian country is we're always trying to reinforce our children. The youth is probably the biggest thing that we have going for us right now. So on to the policy. This is some of the stuff that I'm working on right now currently. First of all, I'm still looking at the NRCS cost share programs. This was a big hurdle because, in 2017, there were only 1,035 NRCS cost share contracts out of 49,000. That's only 2%, and so why aren't we participating more? That's the main thing. Why aren't we participating more? But still the potential for NRCS to play conservation practices, there's still 99 million acres of American Indian lands that could be available for people to actually, have conservation practices on. But in order to do that, there has to be certain laws that the tribes have to adopt, and the federal government has to change a few things in order for us to fully participate in some of the stuff that's coming down the line. Why is this important? Because, in the 2018 Farm Bill, right now they're predicting that there's going to be $33.4 billion available for conservation programs. That's a huge lot of money. And if we're only getting 2% of that, we're not really getting our fair share, if you want to call it that, because there's so much we can do out in the Indian country. So some of the barriers, this is one of the first papers that I published in Ecosystem Services. I looked at some of the barriers. So what's causing this problem? So I'm still looking at some of those barriers and trying to come up with solutions by working with organizations like the Indian Agricultural Council, Indian Land Tenure Foundation, even the Nature Conservatory, and some of the other organizations that are out there. But so what are some of the barriers? Well, first of all, those small languages, That's not like private property, because in Indian country, we have multiple layers of land ownership. We just don't have, one land classification. We have things like ceded land, trust land, allotted land. In our case, we have village land, clan lands, and so forth. And they cause a lot of jurisdictional issues as far as management is concerned. And we're still working on that. The lack of capital is always a big problem in Indian country, because we just don't have the capital to, even if we were to get a 90% cost share contract with the NRCS, we might not even have the 10% to even get it started. And so that's unfortunate. Then there's this lack of communication that I always talk about. And then the institutional design flaws, sometimes what some of these federal programs offer us, because of how they're laid out, they don't fit our particular system, and I'll explain a little bit. They don't fit our system well enough so that they'll become useful. For example, when I was out here as an agent, they wanted me to convince my people to put a cover crop of wheat on their fields in the wintertime. And I said, what do we know about managing wheat? And so it made no sense to do that, because in the end, that's also going to take soil moisture away from the soil. And so during the wintertime, so what are we doing this for? But it's that type of idea that sometimes you have to look at and figure out, well, how can we change some of this? How can we make this better? First of all, what is indigenous agricultural knowledge? It's an applied knowledge for raising food and other agricultural products that is grounded in indigenous belief systems and practices which have been time tested over a millennia. And that's important, because a lot of what we're doing needs to help reinforce some of these ideas that we have. Now, I just want to show you this because I think, this is interesting. It's looking at indigenous agricultural knowledge versus the NRCS standards that are out there. And this is kind of scientific based, whether you want to call it Western versus traditional ecological knowledge base, but it's kind of like that. So when you look at some of the criteria that's stacked up, like rigor, societal norms, panel of experts, processes, replicability, that's all science, Western science based. How is it different? Let's look at the rigor. Time-tested natural experiences over millennia. Scientific methods, short-term experiences for the most part. Societal norms, indigenous value systems versus what I call a capital value systems. And maybe I shouldn't say that, but I think it's a good place to say that, because a lot of things that are out there are designed to help spur on efficiency as well as conservation. But because of that, it's giving that person the big bang for the buck. But our panel of experts, to break it down even simpler, are just our rituals, our history, our stories by our elders. My panel of experts are peer review process, the scientists. Like I was just talking before this conversation started, it took me almost 1.5 years to get this latest publication published, And so, but it did, and it's going to be out this summer in the Journal of Water and Soil Conservation. So I'm really happy about that, and I'll talk about that chapter in brief. And so our process is very informal. The NRCS standard process of getting things approved is very formal, and here's the key, here's the kicker: 2,000 years of replicability versus 200 years of replicability with NRCS and their standard practices. So you have to ask yourself, who's more valid than the other? So, when I talk about, this is the Journal of Water Soil Conservation that the title of my article is going to be looking at. And this focuses on conservation outcomes. And I'll show you a little bit of examples of this. But what this is saying that with 3 tribes is that it's showing that our traditional practices have the same outcomes as what the Natural Resource Conservation Services has in their scientific proven experts. And I'll show you kind of the meaning of what it's about. So here's one of the models from that paper. It looks like the holistic approach is on the left of what we do. NRCS standard practices are very linear. They have a name for each particular practices, but they all have the same conservation outcomes. And that's the important part, is that they're doing the same thing. But I would make a case that the ones on the left also add a lot more benefits, because they're increasing a person's health, they're increasing a person's diet, so to speak, that relates to health, and so forth and so forth. And so you're getting a bigger bang for your buck. And you're also, in my opinion, conserving the environment a lot better. And let's look at contour farming, because this is something that NRCS calls contour farming. We've been doing this particular practice, planting perpendicular to soil runoff for hundreds of years. But the practice on the right gets federal funding. The practice on the left does not. Why is that? Because it's not scientifically proven. It's not showing that we're doing, I guess, contour farming, but we are. It just needs to be explained in a way that particular agency can understand it, and I'm here to help them do that. And here's the other one, crosswind trap strips. Just laying out a barrier in the middle of your field to help with soil erosion and wind erosion, and even water erosion. So that just shows again that, we've been doing this for hundreds of years, but again, like I said, that practice on the right, the NRCS has, that's eligible for federal funding. Ours is not, because it's not scientifically proven. Now, some people might say, well, how much money can you make from this project? Because you're talking about like a 1 acre, 2 acre field versus a 2,000 acre field. But let me tell you this, if we find a way to pick a value monetary price on these crops that we raise, put them 10 to 1. So instead of getting $20 a bushel an acre for corn, what the big producer in the market system gears for, because of all the other value that's on that particular crop, we should be getting $200 a bushel of corn. And so when we have a drought out there, we can go to the Farm Service and say, look, we had a drought, therefore we should, we lost this value of our crop. Some of that money could be kicked back in to incentivize people to farm next year. It sounds like a simple loose solution, but it's really complicated in some aspect, but I'm working on it. And so, some of the stuff, and, when I talk about those type of practices, it's kind of like we have this limited recognition of what IAK is. It's starting to come around now. You can see that's been happening for the last 20 or maybe 15 years now. We're starting to get a voice at the table. And I think that's one of the main reasons why I went into the natural resources, is that I will have my voice at the table, and I do have my voice at the table. I'm talking to some good organizations. The Environmental Defense Fund, is one of them. And so we're National Defense Fund. We're talking to some of these good organizations right now. And, and so what I'm proposing, and it's just an idea, is that NRCS has what they call this Field Office Technical Guide, which has all their standard practices in it. What I'm talking about is organize this Indigenous Field Office Technical Guide. That could be regionally based, because it seems to me when you have a co-op of tribes, like an organization of tribes, they're a lot better than individuals because they have a lot more places to do things. Like right now at NAAF, we have this vision document that's on our homepage that outlines how we want to see agriculture in Indian country for at least the next 20 years. That also involves, regionally based processing plants, regionally based food hubs, things that when these types of crises come out again, we're able to take care of ourselves. And we do such a good job that, for example, when our COVID vaccines came out, we finished our tribe, but then we started giving them out to non-Indians, so we're still here to help. That's the beauty of what we do. That's what makes us, good, if you want to call it that. So this collaborative effort that I'm working on is happening right now. Some of the solutions of the lack of capital, because that's a big one. There's this thing called alternative funding arrangements. It's been initiated now, it's been adapted, and it was just a simple word change in there. It said it went from may to shall enter into this alternative funding arrangement with tribes. That means that the conservation funding coming from NRCS has the possibility of going directly to the tribes so that they can come up with their own management systems and pretty much do with the money what they want to do with it, as long as it meets the criteria and some of the rules and regulations that the agency has. It also recognizes our tribal agricultural structures and systems. It will be allowed to do that because we'll be the decision makers on what the funds will be used for, and that's very important in Indian country. So some of the other key solutions that I'm working on, that some of them I was not aware until I got to this organization that I'm in, is that there's this piece of legislation that was passed in '93 called the American Indian Agricultural Management Act. In that act, they call for 10-year Indian agricultural resource management plans. If the tribe was to do that and adapt that, they would be able to basically, again, control what happens out there in Indian country. Unfortunately, a lot of tribes don't have that. And so one of our things is try to develop a guidebook that would allow tribes to get through that process. Because what that does is it puts the Bureau of Indian Affairs in the back seat for a lot of approval authority. And that's important. Same thing with this Helping Expedite and Advance Responsibility Tribes Home Ownership Act. That creates 25-year leases that tribals can control too. And there's a section in there, even though it says tribal home ownership, there's a section in there that allows for agriculture. That's important, like agricultural business leases. And that's important, very important. Unfortunately, a lot of our land on Indian country is leased to non-Indians. And what I mean, unfortunately, is because we're losing all that revenue and all those value-added products that are transported off the reservation after the harvest is done. And so we need to find ways to help encourage tribes to go this direction, if and only they choose to do so. And is there help available? Yes, there is. The University of Arkansas, under the Indigenous Food and Agriculture Initiative actually has a big code out there, a big code on a number of topics. One of them has to do with traditional food and cultural property that's in this code. It's a beautiful code. I think it's 860 something pages, but there's something in there for every part of Indian country when it comes to natural resource management. So we're trying to encourage tribes to try to develop a code to help protect themselves in many ways. So that's kind of what I'm working on. So some of the conclusion here is, like I said, to meet the pressing environmental challenge we face as a broad society, we must create new environmental solutions through integration of Western-based science and indigenous agricultural knowledge whose very foundations are based and grounded in survival. We talk about proof of concept, talk about the proof of survival, and so it's very important that we do that, and so that's kind of what I'm doing right now. I'm doing a lot of other things. I'm also helping monitor some of the grants that we put out there for a number of organizations out there who are dealing with agricultural stuff. And so, but that's pretty much what I do right now. And so it's just a great place. NAAF's a great place to work right now, but I'm just gearing up to take a next step at some point in my career. And so this is what I'm doing. And so since after I graduated, guys, this is where I'm at. So thanks a lot for helping me out. Thanks a lot for sharing, let me share this.
Thank you, Michael. We really, yes. We appreciate all your interesting work and all the directions that you're taking. And I don't know if you noticed before you even started, you had a couple comments of people that were so happy to see you come back. Greg Garfin and Cornelia Santos.
Oh, good, good.
Were, commented they're happy to see you. Sophia Gonzalez said that 2,000 years of replication is science, and she thanks you for your powerful, concise phrase on Indigenous knowledge and science. Also another comment of a great talk from Amber, and but a question from Dipendra. What are the activities and efforts that the Indigenous community are putting to draw the attention of the federal government, and of course to convince them for funding support?
I mean, there's a number of initiatives that we're taking right now. We're trying to get, first of all, more involved with the food chain, and trying to get some of our products recognized out here for what they are. Unfortunately, there was a study done that says that there's been no monitoring of how much carbon we have out here available on Indian reservations. There's been no studies done on that, and so that's unfortunate because most of our land has pretty much been left alone for centuries. And so we're talking about grazing land, agricultural land, just land that's never been touched. And so when that new initiative comes out with carbon banking, we may or may not want to participate in that, but the land is out here to do that. And so that's important. A lot of the things that we're doing is things, like I said, we had that big seed convening that we had at our organization, and that brought out a lot of interesting things, like how are we going to increase the seed supply? One good example I would like to talk about would be the Cherokee Nation. They've got about like 8 or 10 acres available that they're just raising seeds on, traditional seeds, and they're giving them to the community. And what's the kicker about that, guys, is that they have a lot of money there from the casinos, but they don't use that money to raise their products. They use like USDA money and BIA money. Why is that? Because these things are culturally significant to that tribe. That's how, when I talk about putting a value on this, they're that important. There was a recent study done that I saw that was just out looked. I think it was the ribosomes or something on corn that's been breeded out like 20 something years. And because of the nitrogen use and some of the other stuff, the shrinking of those roots started off pretty broad, but then 20 years later, it's slowly going down to nothing. And if you don't have a good root system, you have nothing. You're just planting poles in the ground. Our root systems go out 20 feet. They mine water out that far. I've seen that. They're very fibrous. And so you need a good root system. And so we have to figure out ways that we can help. I was talking to the State Department yesterday. They called me on the phone, believe it or not. I got a call from the State Department. They want to try to find how to bridge indigenous knowledge versus the science and technical aspects of what they're doing right now. And so science and technology. And so I'm trying to give them some advice on that. And so,
I mean, so given the value that you can provide, do you see funding equity in the future?
Yes, I do. It's coming. It's there. It's we're partnering with a lot of organizations right now to make sure that we're part of that. If you were to look at our vision document on our webpage, you'll see a lot of that, what we're doing and what our vision is. And so a lot of that's coming true. We're getting a lot of, people out there, some of the big organizations out there. I can't remember quite their names, but they do a lot with the food chain stuff. They're starting to look at buying more native products, because of the sustainability metrics that we have are geared towards that. And so it's kind of neat. It's a good time. It's a good day to be Indigenous, some people tell me, but it's a good time.
Thanks. So next question from Sophia Gonzalez. What are the questions that you ask or frameworks that you use to shift misconceptions on land policies? Or philosophies, land philosophies.
It's kind of hard to do that because we don't have the same value systems. Even tribes have different value systems with each other, and it's kind of hard to relate that in a cross way. I just think that it's unless we begin to gear towards that, like the stewardship approach rather than the private property approach, it's going to kind of go bad in some ways. But you just really have to have that relationship, and that's kind of hard to think. You can't prove, unfortunately, the market system does not allow for things like value systems. But what's interesting though, the new carbon market system will. You'll get a higher price for carbon if you have these other things attached to it. One of them is culture, and so that's what I mean. The potential's there, but there's also the potential for exploitation is there too, because we haven't figured out a system of how to protect what's out there. And so we need to work on that first before we participate in some of these fantastic programs that are coming out.
Do you mean
I hope that answered your question, Sophia.
Sophia, could you chime in? Did that answer?
Like
I was thinking.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly what I was thinking about, just different philosophies on land ownership. So the fact that you're sharing, there's this big gap between getting to a values-based system coming from market-based.
Mm-hmm. That's a big switch.
I think I answered.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you very much.
And were you alluding to cultural appropriation as?
No, I don't think it's cultural appropriation. It's just the value that's added to value-added products. When you take for example, a corn down that goes through this whole cycle of being processed at the very end, it gets these different values as it gets added on. But for us, because of the stuff that we put in, actually planting it, growing, using it, cultivating, doing all that stuff, that should be our value system that's added all the way up. And because it's very biodiverse and because it has all these other benefits with it, it should be off the charts. The NRCS has this conservation planning. They have all these rules and regulations and all these steps to add things on there. And the ones that have the highest points usually get the most of the money awarded to them in contracts. If they were just to tweak that a little bit, where we can put in all these other extra incentives of what we do, all these other extra values of what we do, we'd be competing and outbidding them. But it's not geared towards that right now. Right now, the market system's geared towards basically money. How efficient, that's the thing. It's all about efficiency. How efficiency can you make your crop to produce the most stuff to get out there? It's not about quality anymore. It used to be about that a long time ago, but it's not about quality anymore. It's all about quantity. We don't produce that, but just our little acre, that has a lot of monetary value if you really look at it from a biodiverse environmental standpoint of view. It really does, and it can stack up out there. But we need to figure out ways to trigger that marketing system to work.
Or to put value on being able to use arid land.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, Hopis, we're the expert dry farmers. We can tell when the drought's coming. We don't need NOAA to tell us that. But yet again, when it comes to saying that we're having a drought, there's very few weather stations on Indian reservations. If you were to blanket what NOAA has out there, you would see hardly anything on Indian reservations. And unfortunately, but that presents a data problem. So when we try to participate in some of these drought relief programs, where's our data at? Our data is like our monitoring stations in Flagstaff. Well, it's a lot different in Flagstaff and the Southwest, as people know, when it comes to how monsoon rain events and precipitation events come down, right? And so we got to have that data, and so we're trying to figure out ways that we can have, maybe more weathering stations out here, just to show that we have the data, and it's all about the data, right? I mean, that's the thing. I can tell you, this our conservation, our agricultural practices preserve soil moisture. I had to do that for Dr. Bashir's class. I know I had to do that. And so, I was able to do that with all the fancy terminology that we learned there, and so that's what I did. And so that was kind of a kickoff going down this road. But, it's just a matter of, just getting some of that more supported. I think right now the Arizona, what is it called? The Agricultural Research Services, they just called me on the phone the other day. They want to look at some of our traditional techniques, and they come up with this app that would determine where the soil moisture is, that would help our farmers to plant in different areas that I think would be useful, at least for the younger generation. It looks like a beautiful app, but ARS is behind it. And so, but for me, because we're not a lobbying organization, what I do basically is that I can point people in the right direction. Who they need to talk to, who they need to have, what can make things happen. That's what I'm good at. And so, but also part of my responsibility is for a lot of outreach. So giving talks like this, talking with different people throughout either government or non-governmental sector, and also opening a lot of eyes. And this degree, I can't help to emphasize that, getting a PhD from a research institution like the University of Arizona in the sciences for an Indigenous person is one of the best tools that you can have to help other people, because it's not really about helping myself, it's really about helping other people. And so, yeah, that's kind of a long answer to your question, but that's kind of how I feel sometimes.
Thanks. And Sophia has another question. What is important about the Bureau of Indian Affairs in the backseat of efforts through the Indian Agricultural Management Act?
Well, I don't want to hit the Bureau too hard too, but for a long time, we haven't had a great relationship with the Bureau. We were under the War Department. Indians were under the War Department for a long time, and then we got the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and we're supposed to be trustees of the federal government. So it's kind of like a parental mechanism that basically tells tribes what to do. We, under the Self-Determination Act of 1975, were able to come out from under that to some point. But for example, when we have a business lease, we have to have the Bureau of Indian Affairs sign off on it. When it comes to a natural resource lease, we have to have the Bureau of Indian Affairs sign off on it. And because of where we're located in the whole Department of Interior, we're also in the same department that the Bureau of Land Management's under, and some of the other ones. And we're always having to try to overcome those within our own ranks. And so we're not being heard properly. And so sometimes we have to take the back seat. Like, for example, coal leases, if some people who are in the private market can get $20 a ton, but if the Bureau sets the price, we only could get $10 a ton. So we're not able to play in that private market system. And so that's the cause of the big problem. And so we're trying to come out from under that. But with these new acts that I mentioned will allow us to come out from under that and have our own leases and our own negotiation capabilities to get the big bang for the buck, if that's what we want to do.
Thanks. And Dave Brashears is thanking you for a great talk. Wonderful to hear about all you're doing. He is qualifying his question, saying this was probably in your term paper 16 years ago, but he doesn't recall specifics. So he's asking, how variable is production year to year? That is, how much can you buffer the climate variability in corn production?
Well, not that much. We have, because what we see on the ground with those plants that I talked about, some years we'll have a crop, some years we won't have any crop, and so, but we're smart enough to plant to last at least 3 to 5 years. And if you look at the cycle of El Nino and El Nino cycles, we're catching some of that, right? And so it allows us to have some sort of variability, but it varies from year to year when it comes to crop production. And so, but we've learned to do little tricks like that. For 2,000 years of tricks, it finally comes out pretty good. But really appreciate asking that question. That was one of the most hardest classes I took at U of A, by the way, but it really did teach me a lot. And so I'm really, I'm thankful for that. Appreciate that.
So we still have 5 minutes. There's no harm in ending a few minutes early. Oh, wait, another question just popped up. You're still on the hook.
Okay.
Stuart, Koyiyamtewa,
Yeah. Mhm.
is the Hopi tribe aware that you are sharing this type of information?
Yes, they are. I've told them that through my dissertation process and things like that. And and they are aware of that. You know, they may not think that, but they are aware of that. And I am a farmer, you know, I am a member of the tribe, you know, and so that's what I'm supposed to do. That's what I was told to do. In fact, some of the elders up there in Shamopavi, Harold Joseph, told me if I ever have a problem with this, that he's the one that said that I could do this. He's the one that's given me a lot of this advice. So yeah, that's how I answer that question.
All right, so I was going to ask if anybody in the audience wants to jump in verbally with a question. Feel free to do so. Michael, if you want to stop sharing your screen, you can see everybody.
Yeah, it's fine.
You know, if you view your gallery view anyway, there's all the faces are there for you. That's kind of fun to see everybody. At least those that are willing to show their homes, who are willing to show their homes to you.
I had a question. You know, one of the things that I struggle with is teaching classes on this and not, you know, some of the tribes have associated ceremonies and societies, and teaching, not going there. And I just was wondering how you, I don't go there, but I was wondering how you handle that part of it.
Well, you know, if you look at all of my stuff, I don't talk about the ceremonial aspects of Hopi at all. You know, I don't talk about that. Everything that I've talked about is already been written in books. You know, it's already been out there. A lot of it's been proposed by that, and so I stay clear of that. You know, even the Cultural Preservation of Office, they have a number of books out there that do talk about some of the spiritual components of Hopi, which I don't know is proper or not. But you know, I look at it that way. I just talk about the facts. I talk about our cropping system. You know, some people will say, well, you know, we're worried about, you know, what if this knowledge gets, you know, adopted by another tribe, you know, but and I worry about that too at sometimes, but we always have the claim onto a lot of those cultural appropriate questions. And so I'm not sharing anything that's already been produced out there. In fact, the Cultural Preservation Office supported a study on looking at some of the genetics that were behind our corn up at Crow Canyon. You know, but the main thing I do want to stress though is that a lot of our knowledge should be and data should be held within the confines of the tribes where they came from. You know, we should have absolute authority of the data that's out there. And so that's one of also the areas that I'm trying to preserve too, is to make sure that we do have our culturally appropriate data where it's supposed to be, you know, and so that's how I'd probably answer that question. So it is a constant struggle with me. So.
Yeah, I do struggle with that, but I tell my students, you know, nothing considered sacred, nothing that has to be mentored or anything society knowledge. I'm just trying to make sure there's an element of respect for tribal knowledge being kept within the tribe.
Yep, so. That's what it should be. I can't say every tribe is different, right? And so that's all I could say on that particular question.
Yeah, that's true. Wondered how you dealt with that.
Good to see you there, Ron. I haven't seen you there in a while.
I've been hiding out, so you can't see me. But I
know you're working on a book. Yes, sir.
I'm working on a book that I'll talk to you. I did notice that you didn't emphasize the maintaining the seeds as they evolve, as your conditions change. That your seeds are adapted by keeping them picking the best each year.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I didn't really talk about that. You know, we as a man in our society, it's the women who control the seeds. They're the ones who look for the certain traits that are out there, and they're the ones who store the seeds away for the next year to give to the person who's going to plant the following year. And so they're the ones who know more about that than I do. I know some of it. I know some of how they're doing that. But you know, one of my main things out here, and I would like to try to start, would be some sort of agricultural plots out here that would allow us to grow out some seeds, during 1 year so that they wouldn't lose their drought viability and put them back into the community on a bigger scale. Because over time, we're starting to lose a lot of these traditional varieties because not as many people are planting as they used to. That's a big problem out here. And so, one of the main things we could do is organize a co-op of farmers out here, and get more people involved. So when they do produce something, they could just bring back a little bit so that we can store and then we could also give out the following year or use it to plant during a drought year. And so these are just some of the ideas I have to have. But, of course, I have to go to the Cultural Preservation Office to have that approval, but it'd be something that I think would benefit the whole Hopi society. I get talks all the time with some of the elders that come visit me. They say, well, how can we preserve some of these seeds, and stuff like that, because we just don't grow enough with them. And so that's pretty much the answer.
So
to
you're
that question.
talking about supporting the system that keeps the seed preservation going that you used to have.
That's right. That's right. Because you don't want to irrigate for more than 1 or 2 generations, I don't think, because then the drought tolerance that's in those seeds, I think, dissipates over time. And so that's why it's important for us to just, grow out enough, because unfortunately what's happening right now is our ceremonies are continuing, but not enough people are farming. And during these ceremonies, there's a lot of this stuff that we produce that are used in those things. And so they're heavily taxed, as far as being used when we do have these social events. And so we need to find ways to preserve that.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Oh, yes, I see that Ben is saying, we're glad to see you publishing your articles. And I didn't know that you had so many out. So I'm really glad to see that.
Yeah, I just got one out, Journal of Water Soil Conservation Service. And I think it's my 3rd chapter looking at conservation outcomes. That's coming out this coming summer. And so I'm happy to do that. And
That's
I know
great.
me and you have another one to work on the resiliency of Hopi agriculture that I want to get out to so pretty soon. But everything takes time. Everybody knows that.
Oh, yes.
You're getting lots of comments. Sarah Rinkovich, Greg Garfin, Dave Brashear, Susan Starrett, Cornelia Santos, all are saying great talk. Informative, interesting. Lots of kudos to you.
Yeah, and I also want to put my hats off to the Cultural Preservation Office too, because sometimes we don't see eye to eye on things. But when any type of research is done out here, even my dissertation, the tribe has a CRAT board that looks at some of the studies that are done out here, and so any research that is done out here in Hopi has to be approved by them. And so that's very important too. I don't think people understand that. You just can't go into an area and just do research without having the consent of the tribe. And so that's very important that Hopi has that. So my hat's off to Stuart over there.
And you had to go through that too.
Yes, I did.
Member didn't mean you could avoid that.
Yep, just being I'm a member, I have to do that too. And I think that's important too. And so I had to get an approval from that organization, and I did. And so it makes the IRB process at the university a lot better too. And so it helps out a lot. It's good to see everybody. But
Good to see you.
good to see Thea down there too. I haven't seen her in a while.
Michael, thank you so much for speaking today. It
You're
was
welcome.
great to wrap up our academic year of Native Voices in STEM with your talk. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
So